Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave podcast. Today we have special guest Dan Abel. So Dan, welcome. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
You bet. Well, Dr. Dave, background is Coast Guard. So I retired 3 years ago after 38 years with the Coast Guard. And early years in the Coast Guard were doing fun things like driving ships and helicopters. And then as I got more senior, ended up that I was almost like the Grim Reaper. Wherever they put me, there seemed to be a major calamity that required some crisis leadership. Hurricane Sandy, Deepwater Horizon, Boston Marathon bombing. I did have some successes. We drilled for oil up in the Arctic without spilling any, which was a good thing. And then in my later years, so I had command up in Boston. That's where I encountered Hurricane Sandy and the Boston Marathon bombing. And then I had command of the Coast Guard forces out in the Alaska and the Arctic. Did a couple tours with DoD. I was Deputy Chief of Operations for Northern Command, which is the old NORAD, which now does Homeland Security, Homeland Defense with the military. And then I was the Chief of Operations for U.S. Southern Command, which is how the military works with the 31 countries of Central and South America. My final tour in the Coast Guard, I was Chief of Operations. We call it Deputy Commandant for Operations, but it's basically the Chief of Operations for the Coast Guard, which put me in a unique position because once a week I would go across the river, across the Potomac to the Pentagon, and I would sit with my peers of the other military services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and we would talk through vexing issues and is our nation prepared or how is our nation responding to worldwide pressures. And then also in the same week, I would sit with my peers within the Department of Homeland Security, which is where the Coast Guard resides. You know, we're talking TSA, FEMA, Secret Service, those folks, and talk about how are we doing with threats to the homeland. So kind of had a foot in both worlds. Finished up I was due to retire just as COVID hit, and then I was asked to interview with Secretary Azar, who was Secretary of Health and Human Services. He wanted a senior crisis leader to stand up his joint coordination cell. And so then I stayed on active duty for an extra year and was a direct report to him and worked with the White House, FEMA, and looked at how do we make sure that the federal role in COVID optimized the federal impact and minimized loss of life and sickness around the country. So a very long answer to a simple question, but so really I guess if you were to put any sort of bumper sticker on my car, it would be crisis leadership is kind of where my service in the Coast Guard took me.
Nice. Well, I'd have to argue with you just a bit because you're like, well, that's a long answer to a short question. Well, when you had a 38-year career, that really wasn't a long answer. I just had to be honest with you. For whatever that's worth.
Yeah.
So, no, I'm sure we'll get into some of those experiences a little bit later.